Thank you for joining us today for this session. My name is Anna Ravenga. I'm a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Group here at Brookings. And I'm going to be moderating this event on economic mobility across generations. I don't know if you all had a chance to watch the little background presentation that was playing while you walked in, but traditionally around the world, education has always been considered a main driver of economic mobility. And in that PowerPoint, there were some very heartwarming stories about Tari or Anisha or even Jim Kim, the World Bank president, and how through education, his family moved up and children had better opportunities. And I think in many ways, this is a story that resonates with everybody. Probably many, many people in this room feel the same way. I know that my Spanish grandparents had respectively 3 and 2 years of education, and my father was able to go to university. My siblings and I, we have graduate degrees, and our life chances were very much revolutionized by the fact that my father was able to get an education. So I think for a long time we've taken it as granted a little bit that this process of children doing better than their parents through educational mobility was something that is there to stay. And unfortunately, just yesterday, the World Bank launched this new report that's entitled Fair Progress, Economic Mobility Across Generations Across the World. And for the first time, this report compiles data on economic mobility as viewed through the lens of education, especially for a large number of developing countries, for over 140 developing countries. And when the team analyzes these data, they find some really striking and sobering findings, which is that educational mobility and economic mobility, presumably, has stalled in many parts of the developing world since the 1960s. And obviously, this raises real concerns about the ability of countries to reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and offer its citizens better opportunities in life in the future. And this is not just a problem in developing countries. I think in high-income countries alone, also, we see in some places a similar phenomenon, including in the United States, the fact that mobility is stuck and that children are not necessarily doing better or going to do better than their parents. So with the occasion of the launch of this report, we thought it was very timely to host a conversation and here at Brookings, and we're very pleased to be able to have with us both the 2 lead authors of the report, as well as 2 distinguished panelists. And what we hope to do is to have a conversation, first with our presenters and our panelists, and then with you, with our audience, around this topic of economic mobility, educational mobility, but also income mobility. So let me say a few words about our panelists and presenters, and then I will hand the stage over to our 2 main authors of the report. So first, we have with us Miles Korak, who's a professor of economics and a senior scholar with the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He is an expert in inequality, social mobility. He has written extensively on these issues, on child poverty, on child rights, on intergenerational mobility. So we're very happy to have him with us and count on his expertise. And we also have with us Rebecca Winthrop, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Universal Education here at Brookings. She has, again, a long list of publications and expertise in the area of education and learning. She was the former head of education for the International Rescue Committee, and she's a member of a large number of advisory committees, global initiatives on education and learning. And so she, in particular, I think, can give us a very interesting perspective from the educational side. And then we have our 2 presenters, Ambar Narayan, who's one of the lead authors of the report. He's a lead economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank. And most of his work has focused on policy analysis, research on the micro aspects of development, including equity, inequality of opportunity, poverty reduction, and the impact of economic shocks. And our other presenter is Ron Weider-Weide, is an economist with the Poverty and Inequality team in the Development Research Group at the World Bank. So he sits in the research arm of the World Bank. This is a collaboration between those two groups. And his work focuses on the empirics of inequality, poverty reduction, poverty and inequality mapping, spatial econometrics. So they are going to give us a brief presentation of what is a very long and comprehensive report. They have 15 to 20 minutes. Following that, we will ask the panelists to join me on the stage, and we will start our conversation, and then we will turn to you in the audience to continue that conversation. So on that note, let me hand it over to, I think, Roy, who, in addition to presenting, just got married, so I'm going to take the opportunity to congratulate him on his marriage. I understand he interrupted his honeymoon to be here, so I hope the audience lives up to the expectations of interrupting a honeymoon. So thank you very much, Roy.
Yeah, it works. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roy, for those who don't know me, and as Anna mentioned, Amber and I, with the help of our team, are the authors of the report launched here today. Let me take this opportunity also to thank our team, as well as Brookings for hosting us here. The report, titled Fair Progress, provides estimates of economic mobility across generations on a global scale. It also identifies factors associated with higher mobility in order to draw implications for policy. If you wish to tweet about this event or the report, which we encourage, of course, we reserve the hashtag #FairProgress without the question mark. In the lead up to this launch, we ran a social media campaign under the hashtag #InheritPossibility. The story shown here by Irene is one of many stories we received and provides an inspirational example of upward mobility across 3 generations of women. It, however, also highlights the important role played by parents in shaping the future of their children and their grandchildren. Let me just highlight the last sentence from Irene's story that nicely illustrates that. All this because my great-grandmother, someone who didn't finish 8th grade, made sure every single one of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren understood the unmeasurable value of a good education. Stories like this are about the triumph of human spirit to overcome odds, held by families, mentors, as well as appropriate public interventions. It should be noted, of course, that not all children are fortunate enough to receive the help needed to overcome their odds. There will be millions of untold stories of unfulfilled potential due to lack of opportunities, and this in a way motivates our report. Economic mobility across generations is a key element of human progress, linked to inclusive growth and fairness. The report distinguishes between 2 distinct concepts of mobility: absolute, whether individuals are better off than their parents, and relative, how closely an individual's rank on the socioeconomic ladder is tied to their parents' rank. Absolute mobility can be viewed as a measure of progress, where relative mobility indicates whether this progress is fair or not. Hence the title of the report, Fair Progress, ? We measure absolute mobility as the percentage of individuals who surpass their parents in terms of education. Relative mobility is measured by a coefficient that captures the strength of the relationship between individual education and education of the parents. The stronger this relationship, the lower will be relative mobility. Note that we can have a society where absolute mobility is high without relative mobility, and vice versa. Everyone can be better off than their parents, while individuals and parents occupy the same positions relative to their own generations. The database we compiled for this report is, in all modesty, unprecedented in coverage. This is the first time, I repeat, the first time, we have empirical evidence for almost 150 countries in the world, representative of roughly 96% of the world's population. In contrast, the largest empirical study on intergenerational mobility to date covers 42 countries. For the 111 countries in our database, estimates of mobility span a period of 5 decades, from those born in the 1940s to those born in the 1980s. We primarily focus on mobility in education, firstly, because human capital is a key component of economic welfare. And secondly, the global coverage of education data across generations is what makes it possible to measure mobility consistently across 148 countries in the world. Examining the trends and patterns in mobility from this global database, a number of key findings stand out. Let us highlight 2 of them here. First, mobility, both absolute and relative, is on the average lower in the developing world compared to the high-income world. Second, education attainment of people in large parts of the world is still too closely tied to their parents' education. The fact that absolute mobility is found to be lower in the developing world is perhaps somewhat surprising, given that the scope for improving upon parental education is higher there. The blue bars in this figure measure intergenerational persistence in education, higher values indicating lower mobility, lower relative mobility, I should say. The pink dots measure absolute mobility. In this case, higher values refer to higher levels of mobility. It can be seen that both absolute and relative mobility is lower in the average low-income world, the third bar from the left, compared to the high-income world, which is the second bar from the left. A similar ordering can be observed within the developing world. Observe the cluster of 6 bars to the right of this figure. East Asia and Latin America with higher mobility on the left of that cluster, and South Asia and Africa and South Asia with lower mobility on the right of this cluster. Here we can see estimates of mobility at the country level for the 1980s generation. Absolute mobility in the top panel and relative mobility in the bottom panel. In both maps, darker colors indicate higher mobility. Sub-Saharan Africa is seen to stand out with low levels of mobility, both absolute and relative. In this figure shows the time trend in relative mobility for the average developing country on the left and the average high-income country on the right. Again, higher values in this case indicate lower relative mobility. It can be seen that at any point in time, relative mobility is lower in the average developing world. So not just for the 1980 generation, but all the way from the 1940s to the 1980 generation, relative mobility is lower in the developing world. And what is more, there is no sign that this gap is closing. If anything, it appears that the gap is getting larger. Note also that for the average developing country, it appears that relative mobility has been stagnating since the 1960s. This slide shows the time trend for absolute mobility. While absolute mobility is also lower in the developing world compared to the high-income world, here the gap is in fact closing, despite, I should note, stagnating mobility in the developing world. And this is because absolute mobility is declining in the high-income world. Note that intergenerational persistence, a measure of relative mobility, does not distinguish between upward and downward movements. An example of relative mobility measure that does is, say, the likelihood that an individual reaches the top quarter of his or her generation, given that his or her parents are from the bottom half of their generation. Upward mobility defined this way is found to be low almost everywhere. Yet, and importantly, 46 out of the 50 least upwardly mobile countries are developing countries. The figure on the left here shows this measure of upward mobility for the 1980s generation. The blue bars referring to developing countries and the red bars referring to high-income countries. The figure on the right shows the time trends of this measure of upward mobility for the average low-income country in the top panel and the average high-income country in the bottom panel. Note that if individual success were independent from parents, we should observe a 25% likelihood of making it into the top quarter of one's generation. it can be seen that our estimates are visibly lower than that. And it can also be seen that the lowest values are predominantly for developing countries. Observe the concentration of blue towards the bottom end of this bar chart. Observe also that upward mobility is declining, slightly declining in the developing world, while it is slightly increasing in the high-income world. These are the brown lines in the time trend graph on the right. The two worlds show very similar trends, however, when we disaggregate by gender. Upward mobility is decreasing for boys, and that's the blue line you see there, but increasing for girls, and that's the pink line in the time trend graph. It should be noted that it's not all doom and gloom. Large increases in mobility observed in East Asia, Latin America, and MENA suggest that changing the status quo is possible with appropriate policy action. Furthermore, in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where mobility is particularly low, enrollment rates are showing notable increases in recent years, suggesting that perhaps future generations may be reporting higher rates of mobility there. And where trends in mobility for the average individual may be muted, in many cases, visible improvements in mobility for girls can be observed. It should also be noted that estimates of mobility are reflective of past policies. My co-author, Ambar, who will speak next, will talk about income mobility, but also about how policies, appropriate policy interventions, can shape mobility for younger and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, and thanks everybody for being here, and many thanks to Brookings for inviting us and Anna for the introductions. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about just changing our focus a little bit to relative mobility in income, for which we've also done some work. And what we have managed to do is to compile estimates for a fairly large number of countries, 75 countries, combining estimates from existing studies as well as our own. And the first sort of headline finding we have is that for the countries, for the 75 countries for which we have estimates, we find that the patterns of relative mobility in income more or less are similar to the patterns for relative mobility in education. In other words, the developing countries on the average tend to do worse. But we also notice the second bullet here, which is that there are parts of the world where education mobility really lags, where income mobility really lags behind education mobility. And the next graph is going to show this. So the top panel shows you the map for income mobility across the world. And if you just remember the map from, if you're in your mind, you have a picture of the map of relative mobility of education, you can kind of see that the patterns are similar. You have low mobility in Africa and so on. But then if you see the graph at the bottom, what you will find is that first of all, there is a strong correlation between education and income mobility, but there are major outliers. And I'll just point you to a few examples. The one, you see the point for Colombia, for Ecuador, for Egypt. These are countries which are outliers in terms of the relationship between education and income mobility. In other words, given the correlation between these two, these seem to have much lower income mobility than what would be quote-unquote predicted by their education mobility. So two facts here. 24 of 25 economies in the bottom third by income mobility. Remember, we have 75 countries, so 25 is bottom third, are developing countries. And these are examples of countries which are outliers. We're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between mobility and growth and inequality, just to motivate the idea, which we actually spend a lot of time in the report doing, that why is it important to address intergenerational mobility? Just to keep one thing in mind, I think a basic message that I want sort of to come across is that in general, what is good for long-term inclusive growth is also good for improving intergenerational mobility, both absolute and relative. So that's kind of the broad message. Why is mobility important? First of all, we find, and other studies have also found, that greater education mobility is linked to higher economic growth and lower poverty rates during adult years of the generation. Now, what is this? Why is this happening? It's very intuitive, and there's a lot of literature on this. In a more mobile society, human potential is harnessed more efficiently. In other words, the family that you're born in, the privileges that you're born in matter less than your actual ability and effort. And the resource allocation is also better because it's allocated to people who have the more potential to succeed as opposed to being determined by the circumstances at birth. One little statistic, just back of the envelope calculation we have, shows that being in the top quartile of economies by relative mobility is associated with roughly a 10 percentage point higher GDP per capita compared to being in the bottom quartile. But it's just to demonstrate the extent of the relationship. It's not meant to be a sort of a causal statement. It's a circular relationship because we also know that economic growth in turn is going to increase mobility. And that happens because credit constraints are weakened. The reason why you have intergenerational mobility, according to the sort of the very classic literature, the major reason is to do with credit constraints and so on. And that is weakened as countries develop. And of course, as countries develop, they can generate more resources to spend and invest on policies which help in mobility. But an important message that we have from the report is that there's plenty of evidence to show that economic growth does not automatically lead to greater mobility. It's almost the same as saying, or it's similar to saying that economic growth does not automatically lead to lower inequality. So it's a similar kind of statement, but it applies to mobility. And what we find is that once you control for a country's level of development, actually the amount of public spending matters. And of course, the quality of public spending also matters. And this is just to make the point that it's about deliberate policy choices. More mobile economies tend to have higher public investments in education and public spending in general. There is a similar sort of a circular relationship between mobility and inequality as well. And this is the famous Great Gatsby curve, updated for a larger number of data points. And it essentially shows that countries which are less mobile are also more unequal. And we see a similar relationship whether you use education inequality, education mobility, or income mobility. So the point that we are trying to make here is that it is possible to create a virtuous cycle, what happens to be a vicious cycle of low mobility, high inequality, and therefore a lower rate of inclusive growth can actually be transformed into a virtuous cycle of higher mobility and more inclusive growth through the right set of interventions. And broadly, these interventions can be categorized under this whole idea of equalizing opportunities attributable to the circumstances that one is born in, as well as reducing difference in circumstances. And by that, what we mean is, of course, moderating extreme inequalities in income and wealth. So I'm going to go over this very quickly, and you can read the report. The main message is for pathways to greater mobility is, first of all, as I said, reducing inequality of opportunities. And in doing so, first of all, building ladders to opportunity starting very early in life. And as we go through the literature and review the literature, we actually find something which is quite interesting, which is that even the programs like CCT, conditional cash transfers and other programs, which are widely used and well regarded, the evidence for their long-term impacts, because this is what we are looking for, long-term impacts on learning, on earnings and so on, evidence on that happen to be very scarce in case of many of these programs. But the kind of programs which survive the scrutiny of a critical review of evidence are listed here. And they are essentially about reducing gaps early in the life cycle, starting with mother's health. So maternal health, and then, of course, early childhood development and so on. And the graph here shows that countries with lower rates of stunting have higher mobility, both absolute and relative. This is about public spending for education. And again, the amount of spending matters. We also show correlations showing that the learning outcomes, there's a correlation between the learning outcomes and mobility, and similarly for teacher-student ratio and other measures of the quality of spending in public education matters. The evidence is also strong, by the way. There's one area where evidence is strong, particularly from developed countries, which is that education tracking, which tends to stream students very early on into different streams by quote-unquote ability, tend to lower mobility. And actually reforms which have reduced tracking have managed to improve mobility. I'm not going to talk much about this, but the report, there is a lot about translating education mobility to income mobility, and of course, factor markets are important. Promoting competition is important. Protecting workers against discrimination is important. The graph basically shows that in countries with higher labor force participation, the relationship between education and income mobility is stronger. And that, to me, is an indication that if your labor market is working better, education mobility can be translated to income mobility. And the reason why it's probably not happening in Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco and some other countries that are mentioned as well may have a lot to do with the functioning of the labor market. We know from research in the United States that localized actions matter for mobility. The neighborhood that you grow up matters, and therefore investments in improving the neighborhoods and social environments in the form of infrastructure, social capital, and so on, all these things matter. This is evidence mainly from the United States. Across the world, what we find that the level that mobility is actually associated with the extent of concentration or socioeconomic segregation, as we call it, or the extent of socioeconomic segregation by education within a country. In other words, more the inequality between the different regions within a country in terms of education, less mobile the country tends to be. And finally, fiscal policy. I mean, all this is possible through progressive policies, which of course need to be funded and resourced. So a fiscal policy to support greater economic mobility, the report argues, has three basic sort of fundamental, sort of objectives: reducing inequality in circumstances, income and wealth, mobilizing resources to finance progressive public investment, and of course does not impose a high cost and efficiency, because growth is important for mobility as well. One pattern that I wanted to point out, we find it's a pretty strong result that economies with higher tax revenue and share of direct taxes in total revenue tend to have greater relative mobility, which basically means the more progressive your tax system. All these correlations they're sort of hints of something going on, and we just want to point them out, not as causal or robust results, but as patterns in the data, which should, of course, motivate further research. And I just want to end on this note, which is the question of evidence. Of course, better policies need better evidence, and one of the things that we encountered in doing this work is the fact that it's actually very difficult to measure educational mobility because you lack information about the parents of adults in the household, basically. Long-term panels are almost non-existent in developing countries. So a low-cost survey solution would be to actually include information about parents. We have the Human Capital Project, which has started at the World Bank, which can be an impetus for better data, particularly on learning, because we measure everything by education attainment. We don't know anything about the quality of learning, and that's, of course, not ideal. And we also want to make the point that sometimes it's not just the lack of evidence which lacks to suboptimal policy making. It's also because the poor and the disadvantaged often lack voice in policy making. And therefore, power asymmetries, and this invokes the World Development Report of 2017, those things matter to create the virtuous cycle that I just spoke about. So I'm just going to leave this slide, which is a summary of the main messages of the report. I'm not going to go through them. And thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.